The sound of remorse carries its own distinct melody. It does not manifest as a wail or a desperate entreaty. For the shallow Blackwell dynasty, that particular resonance was the cadence of Dominic Ashford's custom Italian leather shoes against the polished granite as he disregarded their pompous declarations and lowered himself in deference before the woman they had recently condemned as a ragged fortune hunter. Standing witness to their social execution, watching their expressions disintegrate, I understood that their fate had been sealed. A smile was unnecessary. My designation is Thalia Hawthorne, and throughout the initial 6 years of my existence, I remained oblivious to the world's capacity for cruelty. My dwelling was a confined, cacophonous housing complex in Detroit, where ancient radiators clanked like the gasps of the dying. Yet the atmosphere remained perpetually warm with the fragrance of my mother's freshly baked bread and the resonance of my father's mirth. Then, the inferno arrived. It consumed everything during one ravenous nocturnal devastation. The searing heat, the piercing alarms, and subsequently the horrifying quietude that descended afterward remain etched in my consciousness. I endured, extracted from the cinders like a fragment of debris. Ash permanently inscribed into my recollection, though my flesh bore no visible marks. At 6 years of age, I comprehended that comfort was a privilege, and isolation was the singular commodity distributed without cost. The governmental apparatus transferred me to a children's facility on Detroit's periphery. It stood as a colorless structure saturated with colorless sounds. The caretakers were exhausted beyond measure, and the fellow children waged their own invisible conflicts. Swift comprehension taught me that tears possessed no purchasing power. Weeping would not resurrect parents. Pleading would not enrich the broth. Consequently, I ceased my crying. I withdrew into a realm of organization and rationality. While other juveniles engaged in chase games or contested over playthings, I accumulated fragments of cardboard, adhesive, and fractured twigs. I constructed objects. I fashioned diminutive dwellings where the barriers stood firm and the roofing never permitted leakage. This became my method of governing a turbulent universe. At 10 years of age, the atmosphere within the orphanage transformed. It occurred on a Tuesday, outwardly indistinguishable from any preceding day, yet the caretakers exhibited unusual agitation. They scrubbed our faces until the skin burned raw and arranged us in the central chamber. Their whispers concerned a benefactor, an individual with resources sufficient to acquire the entire metropolis. His designation was Dominic Ashford. To society, he existed as the phantom of financial districts, a colossus of manufacturing and sustainable power sectors, renowned for his mercilessness and his fixation on seclusion. He granted no interviews. He attended no formal gatherings. He simply obtained, dominated, and proliferated. When Dominic entered the chamber, the ambient temperature appeared to plummet. He presented as an imposing figure, immaculately attired in a charcoal suit worth more than the structure housing us. His expression remained neutral. His gaze bypassed the formation of optimistic, terrified juveniles attempting to capture his attention. He traversed past the gleaming footwear and manufactured pleasantries. He proceeded directly toward the chamber's corner, where I occupied floor space, entirely disregarding the designated arrangement. I was not attempting to impress this visitor. Indeed, his anticipated arrival had slipped my consciousness. My concentration remained fixed on an architectural model another boy had demolished in an explosive tantrum earlier that morning. It represented a complex construction of frozen confection sticks, and the base had fractured. I was meticulously applying adhesive, employing a miniature clamp I had fashioned from a hair fastener to stabilize the supporting element. A pair of polished ebony shoes materialized beside my hand. I directed my gaze upward. Dominic Ashford observed me with eyes resembling slate. "Why do you not weep?" he inquired. His voice resonated deeply, absent the compassion adults typically plastered across their countenances when addressing us. "The boy obliterated your creation." The anticipated response from a child would be lamentation. I redirected my attention to the damaged structure. "Weeping will not restore the foundation," I stated, my voice subdued, yet unwavering. "The structural soundness has been compromised. Without immediate repair, the adhesive will cure unevenly, and complete collapse will follow. Dominic scrutinized me for an extended interval. Subsequently, for the initial instance, a minute, barely discernible expression emerged at his mouth's corner. He pivoted toward the flustered administrator who was hastening to apologize for my perceived discourtesy. "I shall claim this one," he declared. He did not seek a juvenile to pamper. He did not desire a daughter to adorn in ribbons. He informed me subsequently, as we departed in a vehicle that resembled a spacecraft, that he required an heir who comprehended that the world was fractured and that exclusively those with determination to reconstruct it deserved authority. He perceived intellect where others recognized trauma. Existence at the Ashford estate presented paradoxes. The property was extensive, saturated with artistic works and historical significance, a bastion of isolation nestled in Sonoma Valley. I possessed everything I had previously lacked: sustenance, warmth, education. Yet Dominic was a rigorous instructor. He did not indulge me. He trained me. Evening discussions avoided scholastic gossip, instead addressing market instability, distribution networks, and negotiation psychology. A singular principle governed our existence, a principle Dominic incinerated into my consciousness until it became my skeletal structure. Authentic power remains invisible. "Thalia," he would state, swirling amber fluid in his glass as we occupied the fireside. "The vociferous ones, those exhibiting their wealth and demanding attention. They are the vulnerable ones. They are petrified of being forgotten. We require no vocalization. We possess the ground they occupy. Never disregard that truth. To protect me and to instruct me regarding reality's value, he created a dual existence for me. I was legally adopted, though purely on sealed documentation. To the external world and on all my identification papers, Dominic preserved my name as Thalia Hawthorne to shield me from his adversaries. When I entered university and subsequently the workforce, I did not employ the name Ashford. I adopted the name Hawthorne, my mother's maiden designation. It represented homage to the woman who granted me life and a barrier against individuals who would exclusively cherish me for my father's fortune. I matured understanding that respect required earning, not purchasing. I pursued architecture, not because of expectations, but because that 6-year-old inside me still desired to construct things that would not burn. I graduated with highest honors, yet I did not step into the executive suite at Ashford Corporation. Not immediately. Dominic desired that I observe the world from the bottom upward. Consequently, I became Thalia Hawthorne, the restoration architect. I specialized in preserving old, forgotten structures in the city. Orphanages, community centers, historic libraries that the city planned to demolish. It was exhausting work. My days were spent on scaffolding, my hands covered in plaster residue, my hair secured in a disheveled bun, wearing denim and work boots. I operated a dependable used sedan. I occupied a modest apartment. My colleagues perceived a diligent woman who was passionate about history and community. They observed someone who prepared her own lunch and remained late to ensure the mortar mixture was historically accurate. They had no awareness that the woman scraping paint off a century-old wall was the sole heir to a fortune worth billions. They did not know that the kind elderly father I occasionally mentioned was the man who could shut down their bank with a single telephone call. I walked between two worlds. In the evenings, I would return to the Ashford estate, shower off the dust of the common world, and sit with Dominic to review the quarterly reports of a multinational empire. But during the day, I was just Thalia. I appreciated being just Thalia. It felt honest. It allowed me to see people as they truly were, without the filter of greed clouding their eyes. I thought I understood the game. I thought I was the one in control, observing the world from my hidden vantage point. I was arrogant in my own way, believing that my invisible armor was impenetrable. I did not know that I was about to walk into a trap where my carefully constructed disguise would become the very weapon used to break me. I did not know that a prince made of paper was waiting just around the corner, ready to burn my world down all over again. The first time I saw Preston Blackwell, I was standing on a ladder 15 feet in the air, removing layers of lead paint from a ceiling medallion in a deteriorating gallery space in the Mission District. It was late, and the only illumination came from halogen work lamps that cast long, harsh shadows against the peeling walls. I looked like a disaster. My coveralls were rigid with plaster dust. My hair was a bird's nest of drywall particles, and I smelled faintly of turpentine. Preston walked in like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a fashion photography session. He was wearing a navy bespoke suit that fit him a little too perfectly, the kind that screamed money but whispered insecurity. He was searching for the gallery owner, a frantic man named Pierre, who was currently hyperventilating in the back office about budget overruns. When Preston looked up and saw me, he did not see the heir to the Ashford empire. He saw a laborer. He saw a project. "You missed a spot," he called up, his voice smooth, carrying a practiced charm that I would later learn was his primary defense mechanism. I looked down, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove. "It is a structural crack, not a paint chip. If I fill it without stabilizing the beam first, the ceiling comes down on your expensive shoes." He laughed, and the sound was genuinely pleasant. It was light, unburdened, the sound of a man who had never really had to carry anything heavy in his life. He introduced himself as Preston, omitting his last name initially, perhaps trying to play the part of a casual art enthusiast. He was handsome in a classic, non-threatening way, with soft brown eyes that seemed to promise kindness. We started talking. He was fascinated by the grit of my work, or so it seemed. He told me he worked in real estate, that his family developed luxury condos, but he found the raw potential of old buildings more romantic. It was a good line. It worked on me. For the first time in my adult life, a man was flirting with me while I looked like a mess, without knowing my bank account balance could buy his family's company 3 times over. To him, I was just Thalia, the site manager with the sharp tongue and the dusty boots. Our courtship was a whirlwind, or at least a very specific kind of whirlwind. We did not go to the places where the Blackwells usually frequent, the galas at the Opera House or the charity dinners in Marin County. Preston told me he wanted to escape that world. He said he wanted something real. So, we ate pizza on park benches and drank cheap wine in my modest apartment. I fell in love with the idea that he chose me for my simplicity. I thought I had found the one thing Dominic Ashford could not buy, genuine affection. But love can be a powerful blindfold. I was so relieved to be seen as a normal woman that I ignored the subtle ways Preston tried to edit me. It started small. We would be getting ready to go to a movie, and he would gently suggest that I change my shoes. "Those are a bit clunky, do not you think?" he would say, flashing that boyish smile. "You have such nice legs. Why hide them? Wear the heels." Or we would be walking down the street, and if he saw a group of people he recognized, men in suits with slicked back hair and women with handbags worth $5,000, he would instinctively steer me to the other side of the road, or suddenly become very interested in a shop window. "Just boring colleagues," he would mutter, his hand tightening on my arm. "I do not want to deal with work talk right now. I just want you all to myself." It sounded romantic. It felt possessive in a way I mistook for passion. I did not realize he was hiding me. To Preston, I was a guilty pleasure, a rebellion against his stifling upbringing, but not someone he was proud to display. The illusion began to crack about 4 months in. I was in the kitchen of his apartment, a sleek, impersonal place in Pacific Heights that his parents paid for. I was making tea while he was on the phone in the living room. He thought I could not hear him. Or perhaps he just did not care enough to lower his voice. "No, Mother, she is not a nobody," Preston was saying. His voice strained, pleading. "Her father is a professor at Berkeley. History of architecture. She is educated. She is just bohemian. It is respectable." I froze, the kettle trembling in my hand. My father, Dominic Ashford, had never set foot in a classroom to teach a day in his life. He bought universities. He did not work for them. Preston had invented a pedigree for me. A professor's daughter was safe. It was intellectual, upper middle class, acceptable enough to bring to the dinner table but not threatening to the Blackwell ego. When he hung up and came into the kitchen, I confronted him. "A professor?" I asked, leaning against the counter. Preston flinched, then sighed, running a hand through his perfect hair. "Thalia, you do not know my parents. They are old-fashioned. They care about lineage. I just wanted to smooth the way for us. I did not want them to judge you before they met you. I am protecting you." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fear in his eyes. He was terrified of his mother. He was a grown man, 28 years old, yet he was still a little boy trying to avoid a scolding. I should have walked away then, but I saw his weakness, and I confused it with vulnerability. I thought if I revealed my true identity, it would emasculate him. I wanted to be loved for me, not for the Ashford name. So I swallowed the lie. I let him rewrite my history, because I thought we were writing a future. The proposal came 2 months later on a rainy Tuesday. It was not a grand gesture. There were no violins, no flash mobs. Preston came to my apartment looking haggard. His credit cards had been declined at dinner the night before, a humiliation he had blamed on a banking error, though I knew better. The Blackwells were tightening the leash. He had refused to date the daughter of a banking magnate, and his allowance had been cut. He knelt on my rug, his trousers damp from the rain. He pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring with a diamond so modest it was almost apologetic. "I do not have much right now, Thalia," he said, his voice trembling. "My family, they are making things difficult, but I do not care. I want to build something with you. We can start from scratch. Just you and me against the world. We will build everything together," he promised. I said yes. I said yes because I thought he was choosing love over money. I thought he was brave. I did not know that he was not building a foundation with me. He was looking for a life raft. He was drowning in his own inadequacy, and he saw me as the only person who would not ask him to swim. He did not propose because I was the love of his life. He proposed because I was the only option he could afford. The Blackwell estate in Marin County was exactly what I expected. A monument to insecurity. It was a sprawling neoclassical monstrosity that tried too hard to look like an ancestral home. But the stone was too white, the columns were too thick, and the gold leaf on the front gates was peeling just enough to reveal the iron beneath. It was a house that screamed for attention rather than commanding it. As Preston drove his leased sedan up the long, winding driveway, I could feel him vibrating with anxiety. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror for the 10th time. "Remember," he said, his voice tight, "my mother can be particular. Just let me do the talking. And please, Thalia, try not to mention the construction sites. Stick to the design aspect, the art." I looked out the window at the manicured lawns that looked more like a golf course than a garden. "I am not ashamed of my work, Preston." I know, he said quickly, parking the car. "But for tonight, for me, just play the part." The front door was opened not by a butler, but by a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a catalog for aging debutantes. Cordelia Blackwell was a woman in her late 50s, fighting a losing war against gravity with the help of aggressive plastic surgery and layers of diamonds that were too large for a casual Tuesday dinner. Standing beside her was a younger, sharper version of herself, Preston's sister, Vivian. Vivian had the kind of face that was beautiful until she smiled, revealing a coldness that reached her eyes. "So," Cordelia said, not stepping aside to let us in, but blocking the doorway like a gatekeeper. Her eyes swept over me like a barcode scanner, pricing my dress, my shoes, my lack of jewelry. "This is the one. Mother, this is Thalia," Preston said, his voice cracking slightly. He placed a hand on the small of my back, guiding me forward. "Thalia, my mother, Cordelia, and my sister Vivian." "Nice to meet you," I said, extending a hand. Cordelia looked at my hand for a second too long before offering a limp, cold shake. "You have calluses," she observed, her nose wrinkling slightly as if she had smelled something foul. "I work with my hands," I replied evenly. "How quaint," Vivian drawled, stepping back to let us enter. The interior of the house was an assault on the senses. Everything was velvet, crystal, and polished mahogany. It felt like a museum, where nothing was allowed to be touched. We moved to the drawing room where Preston's father, Montgomery Blackwell, was waiting. He was a portly man with a red face and a cigar that he chewed rather than smoked. He did not stand up when we entered. Preston tells us you are in architecture. Montgomery grunted, swirling a glass of scotch. Is there money in that? Real money? Or is it just drawing pretty pictures? It is a stable industry, I said, sitting in the stiff armchair Cordelia pointed to. Real estate development relies on it entirely. Depends on the connections, Montgomery countered. Without the right name, you are just a bricklayer with a degree. Preston is going into politics next year. City council, maybe Senate one day. He needs a partner who brings assets to the table, not just sketches. The interrogation began in earnest once the drinks were served. Cordelia sat on the edge of her sofa, her posture rigid. Preston mentioned your father is a professor, she said, her eyes narrowing. Berkeley, was it? We know the dean there. What is his name? I felt Preston stiffen beside me. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. He wanted me to lie. He wanted me to invent a name, to play the game of the paper prince. But something in me, the part that Dominic Ashford had forged in the fires of discipline, refused to bend. I was not going to lie about my origins to these people. Preston might have misunderstood, I said calmly, taking a sip of the overly sweet sherry. My biological parents died in a fire when I was 6. I grew up in the state care system in Detroit before I was adopted. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Preston closed his eyes as if in physical pain. An orphan, Vivian repeated, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Like Oliver Twist. You were a ward of the state? Cordelia asked, her voice dropping an octave, losing its feigned politeness. So you have no lineage, no connections. You are a stray. I am a self-made woman, I corrected her, my voice steady. I survived. That is a lineage of its own. Cordelia let out a sharp, derisive laugh. Survival is for rats, my dear. Civilization is for people with breeding. Preston, is this a joke? You bring a girl from an orphanage into this house, into our future? She is talented, Mother, Preston mumbled, looking at the carpet. She is different. Different is a polite word for liability, Montgomery barked. A politician's wife needs a background that can stand up to scrutiny. Do you know what the press would do with a story like that? Blackwell Air marries gutter trash. It writes itself. Dinner is served, the housekeeper announced, saving Preston from having to defend me, which I suspected he had no intention of doing anyway. The dining room was illuminated by a chandelier that was large enough to crush us all. The table was set with enough silverware to perform surgery. I sat between Preston and Vivian. The first course was a pumpkin soup, thick and orange. Throughout the meal, the air was toxic. They spoke over me, discussing people I did not know, vacations in places I had not been to, and making snide remarks about charity cases. So, Thalia, Vivian said, turning to me with a predatory gleam in her eyes, when you are not playing architect, what do you do? Do you volunteer? I suppose you must feel a connection to the unwashed masses. I focus on my work, I said, cutting my bread. It must be hard, Vivian continued, leaning in, trying to fit in where you clearly do not belong. It is brave, really. Most people would have the good sense to stay in their lane. As she reached for the salt cellar, her hand jerked. It was a movement so calculated, so precise, that only someone trained to watch for structural failures would have noticed the intent. Her elbow knocked her full bowl of pumpkin soup. The thick, hot liquid cascaded off the table and landed squarely in my lap. It soaked instantly into the fabric of my simple gray dress, burning my skin and leaving a grotesque orange stain. "Oh my God!" Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in mock horror. "I am so clumsy. I am so sorry." But her eyes were dancing with malice. Although, to be fair, that dress was a bit drab. Maybe the color improves it. "Vivian," Cordelia scolded, but there was no heat in her voice. "Do be careful. We do not want stains on the rug." I sat there, the heat of the soup seeping into my skin. I did not jump up. I did not scream. I slowly placed my napkin on the table and turned to look at Preston. This was it. This was the moment a man who loved his woman would stand up. He would be angry. He would offer his jacket. He would demand an apology. Preston looked at the stain, then at his mother's disapproving face, and then at me. His face flushed red, not with anger at his sister, but with embarrassment. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper. "Jesus, Thalia, look at you. You are a mess." I stared at him. "Your sister threw soup on me. She said it was an accident." Preston hissed, avoiding my eyes. "Do not make a scene. Just go to the restroom and clean yourself up. Please. You are embarrassing me." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than the crystal chandelier above. "You are embarrassing me." In that moment, the romantic haze that had clouded my vision for months evaporated. I saw him clearly for the first time. He was not a prince. He was not even a man. He was a terrified child in a suit, willing to sacrifice my dignity to appease the monsters who controlled his allowance. I did not feel angry. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion. What I felt was cold. I felt the icy clarity of Dominic Ashford settling over me. I looked at Preston, then at Vivian, who was suppressing a giggle, and finally at Cordelia, who was signaling for the maid to clean the floor, ignoring me completely. "You are right," I said softly. My voice was calm, devoid of the humiliation they wanted to see. "I should clean this up." I stood up. The soup dripped from my dress onto their precious Persian rug. I did not apologize. I looked at the stain on the floor, then at the stain on Preston's character. "The restroom is down the hall. Second door on the left," Cordelia said dismissively, not looking up from her plate. "Try not to touch the wallpaper." I walked out of the dining room, but as I washed the orange stain from my hands in the gold-plated sink of their guest bathroom, I was not thinking about the dress. I was thinking about leverage. I was thinking about the bank loans the Blackwell Company had recently applied for. I was thinking about the zoning permits they needed for their new project in the Richmond district. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Thalia, the girlfriend, was dead, drowned in pumpkin soup and cowardice. Thalia Ashford was awake, and she was going to burn this house down, brick by hypocritical brick. We got married on a Tuesday morning at the City Hall clerk's office because it was the only time slot that did not require a reservation fee. There were no white doves, no string quartets, and certainly no Blackwell family members occupying the front row. The only witness was a board administrative assistant who was chewing gum while she signed our marriage license. I wore a simple white suit I had bought off the rack, and Preston wore a gray jacket that he kept pulling at as if the fabric itself was suffocating him. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, Preston did not look like a man who had won a great victory. He looked like a man who had just realized he had boarded the wrong train, but was too embarrassed to jump off. The silence from the Blackwell estate was deafening. There was no congratulatory card, no wedding gift, and most critically for Preston, no check. The financial umbilical cord had been severed. We moved into a small apartment in Oakland that I had found. It was charming in a rustic way, with exposed brick and large windows, but to Preston it was a prison cell. The change in him was not sudden. It was a slow, eroding rot. In the beginning, he tried to maintain the facade of the noble rebel, the prince who chose love over gold. But reality has a way of dissolving romanticism. When the first credit card bill arrived and was declined, the resentment began to seep out. He started to pick fights over trivial things. The coffee was too cheap, the sheets were too rough, the subway was too crowded, but the subtext was always the same. This was my fault. One evening, after a particularly grueling day where he had been rejected for a loan to start his own firm, he exploded. "It is because of your background, Thalia." He spat, pacing around our small living room like a caged animal. "If you had just come from a decent family, or if you had tried harder to charm my mother, we would not be living like rats. You are so stubborn. You have this chip on your shoulder about being self-made that is ruining my life." I stood by the window washing dishes. "I did not ask you to leave your family, Preston. You said you wanted independence." "I wanted independence with a safety net," he shouted. I did not sign up for poverty. He was not living in poverty. We had food, warmth, and shelter. What he was experiencing was the loss of privilege, and to him, that felt like death. I could have ended it then. I could have signed a check that would have silenced his complaints and bought the entire building we lived in. But Dominic Ashford had taught me that money given without effort creates parasites, not partners. I needed to know if Preston had any spine at all. I needed to know if he could build something of his own. So I decided to help him, but from the shadows. I used my contacts within the Ashford network, operating through layers of intermediaries. I set up shell companies and anonymous investment channels. I whispered into the ears of mid-level developers who owed favors to my father. Suddenly, Preston's luck seemed to turn. He landed a contract to renovate a boutique hotel in North Beach. Then, a consultation gig for a new residential complex in the Richmond district. These were small projects for the Ashford empire, crumbs from the table. But to Preston, they were monumental. However, instead of humility, success bred arrogance. He came home one night, flushed with the thrill of closing a deal worth $50,000. "They loved my vision," he boasted, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey he had bought to celebrate. The developers said they had never seen such insight. It just goes to show, Thalia, talent rises to the top. My parents were wrong. I do not need their money. I am a genius at this. He did not thank me for my support. He did not ask about my day, which I had spent managing a multi-million-dollar restoration of a public library. He simply looked at me with a mix of pity and condescension. "Maybe one day, if you learn to dress better and speak with more authority, you can work on a project like this," he said, patting my cheek. "Until then, keep fixing your little community centers." I swallowed the truth. I let him have his victory. I told myself that men need to feel useful, that his ego was fragile and needed nursing. I had made a promise to myself on our wedding day. I would give this marriage 1 year, 365 days of my absolute best effort. If he could not become a man in that time, I would leave with a clear conscience. But the Blackwells were not done with us. Or rather, they were not done with me. About 3 months into the marriage, the phone calls started. It was never Montgomery or Preston's brothers. It was always Cordelia or Vivian. They did not call to invite us to dinner. They called because they had found a use for the stray their son had brought home. "Thalia," Cordelia said one Friday afternoon, her voice as sharp as a diamond cutter. "We are hosting the Senator's charity gala tomorrow night. The event planner has made a mess of the floral arrangements. Since you are so hands-on with manual labor, come over and fix them. Be here by 2. It was not a request. It was a command. When I arrived, they did not treat me like a guest. I was directed to the service entrance. For 6 hours, I trimmed stems and arranged hydrangeas while Vivian stood nearby, drinking mimosas and critiquing my technique. "You should be grateful," Vivian said, watching me struggle with a large vase. "Mommy is letting you be seen at a Blackwell event. Most girls from the gutter would kill for this kind of exposure. Just try not to smell like sweat when the guests arrive." When the party started, I was allowed to stay, but only in the background. I stood near the kitchen doors, wearing a plain black dress, looking for all the world like a member of the catering staff. Preston arrived late. He walked right past me to greet the senator. When he finally acknowledged me, he whispered, "Try to be invisible, Thalia. Do not embarrass me." I endured it. I endured the snide remarks, the servitude, the erasure of my identity. I endured it because I was counting down the days. I was at month 8, 4 months to go. Then came the fracture that could not be repaired. It was a Tuesday in November. Preston told me he had a crucial meeting with a potential investor for a high-rise project. He spent an hour grooming himself, wearing his best suit, and splashing on a cologne that cost more than our weekly grocery budget. "This is big, Thalia," he said, avoiding my eyes as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. "If I land this, we are set. Do not wait up for me. It might go late." Something in his tone triggered an alarm in my mind. It was too casual, too rehearsed. I did not wait up. Instead, I made a call. One of my father's security detail, a man who had watched over me since I was 10, tracked Preston's car. It did not go to an office building or a business club. It went to Larkspur Hall, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. I received a photo on my phone an hour later. It was taken from a discreet distance. Preston was sitting at a candlelit table. Opposite him was not a male investor. It was Serafina Montgomery. She was the daughter of a Texas oil tycoon, a woman with blonde hair, a loud laugh, and a bank account that Cordelia Blackwell had been drooling over for years. In the photo, Preston was leaning across the table, holding Serafina's hand. He was laughing, that open, unburdened laugh he used to give me. When he came home at 2 a.m, he smelled of expensive perfume and wine. "How was the meeting?" I asked from the darkness of the bedroom. "Exhausting," he sighed, loosening his tie, but productive. "The partners are tough, but I think I charmed them." "Partners," I repeated. "Yes, a group of developers from Dallas." He lied smoothly, climbing into bed and turning his back to me. "Boring old men. Good night, Thalia." Lying in the dark, listening to the breathing of the man who had promised to build a world with me, I felt a strange sense of calm. The 1-year clock was still ticking, but the mechanism had just broken. He had not just failed the test of poverty, he had failed the test of loyalty. He was not just a paper prince, he was a counterfeit. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I began to draft a legal document in my head. The time for endurance was over. The time for liquidation had begun. The smell of old money is usually a blend of beeswax, lavender, and arrogance. But that winter, the air inside the Blackwell estate smelled different. It smelled of sulfur and panic. The rumor on the street, which my father's intelligence network had confirmed weeks ago, was that Montgomery Blackwell had bet the family farm on a phantom project. It was a luxury resort development in the Caribbean called Azure Shores. It promised returns of 300%, but in reality, it was nothing more than a few digital renderings and a patch of swampland owned by a con artist who was currently awaiting trial in Zurich. The Blackwells were bleeding. They needed a tourniquet, and they needed it yesterday. I was at their house on a Thursday, summoned by Cordelia to help catalog their wine cellar for a potential auction. It was a humiliating task designed to remind me that my place was among the dusty bottles and the hired help, not at the dinner table. I was wiping down a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux when I heard raised voices coming from the library upstairs. The ventilation shafts in these old houses were essentially acoustic tunnels, and the library vent opened directly above the wine racks. I stopped wiping. I stood still in the cool darkness and listened. "We are down to our last $200,000 in liquid assets, Preston." It was Cordelia. Her voice was not the composed, icy drawl she used in public. It was shrill, bordering on hysterical. "The banks are calling in the loans on the San Francisco properties. If we do not secure capital by the end of the month, we lose this house. We lose everything. Do you understand? You will be working at a gas station." "I know, Mother. I know." Preston's voice was ragged. "But what do you want me to do? I am trying to get more contracts." "Contracts?" Cordelia laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You think renovating a few bathrooms is going to cover a $50 million debt? Wake up, you fool. There is only one way out. Serafina Montgomery." My breath hitched in my throat. I gripped the wine bottle so hard my fingers turned white. "Serafina is willing to marry you," Cordelia continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Her father has agreed to inject capital into Blackwell Holdings as a wedding gift. It is a merger, Preston. A merger that saves your life." "But I am married," Preston said. But he did not say it with conviction. He said it like a child pointing out a minor inconvenience, like rain on a picnic day. "To a nobody," Cordelia snapped. "An orphan with no name and no money. You made a mistake. We all make mistakes. You correct it. You file for divorce. You tell her it is not working. You tell her whatever you need to tell her to get her out of that apartment and out of our lives. Serafina is waiting." I waited. I waited for Preston to shout. I waited for him to say that he loved me. I waited for him to say that vows meant something, that money was not worth his soul. I stood in that cellar for what felt like a lifetime, praying to a God I did not believe in, that the man I chose was decent. Then Preston spoke, and his words were not a defense. They were an execution. "You do not have to worry, Mother," he said, his voice smooth, stripped of all the anxiety he had shown me for months. I never considered her my real wife anyway. I was bored. I was rebelling. She was just a temporary stop, a station I rested at before getting on the real train. I will handle it. Something inside me died in that moment. It was not a violent death. It was quiet. It was the final flicker of the girl who believed that love could conquer class. The Thalia who thought she could fix a broken man with patience and support evaporated into the cold air of the wine cellar. I did not cry. Crying implies a loss, and I realized I had lost nothing. Preston was not a loss. He was a tumor I needed to excise. I placed the bottle of Bordeaux back on the rack with steady hands. I picked up my coat and walked out the service entrance. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I walked down the long driveway, the gravel crunching under my boots, until I was well out of sight of the mansion. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had not called in 2 years. It rang once. Miss Ashford. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. It was Marcus, my father's chief of staff. "Hello, Marcus," I said. My voice was calm, frighteningly so. "I am afraid I have an update for the file." "Go ahead, ma'am." "My father was right," I said, looking back at the looming silhouette of the Blackwell house against the gray sky. "I was wrong. The experiment has failed. It is time to activate the recall process." "Understood," Marcus replied instantly. There was no judgment, only efficiency. "Regarding the anonymous support channels for Mr. Blackwell's business, cut them," I ordered. "Every single one. Pull the funding from the shell companies, cancel the subcontracts. Ensure that every bank in the city knows his credit is toxic. I want the ground to disappear beneath his feet. Consider it done. And for you, ma'am, do you need extraction?" "No," I said. "Not yet. I have one more engagement to attend. I will handle the legal paperwork from my end." I went back to our apartment. When Preston came home that night, he was a different person. He was clearly trying to lay the groundwork for the divorce he promised his mother. He slammed the door. He looked at the dinner I had prepared, a simple roast chicken, and curled his lip. "Chicken again," he sneered, tossing his keys on the table. "God, you are so basic, Thalia. No imagination, no ambition. It is depressing coming home to this." He wanted me to snap. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to scream at him so he could play the victim, so he could tell himself that I was the unreasonable one, that he was leaving me because we were incompatible, not because he was selling himself for a bailout. I looked at him sitting there in his cheap suit, puffing out his chest like a rooster. I saw the weakness in his jawline. I saw the fear behind his aggression. "I am sorry you feel that way, Preston," I said softly, picking up my book. "I will try to be more exciting." He looked confused. My lack of reaction threw him off script. He grunted and stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I began to draft the divorce papers. I listed everything. I waived my right to his assets, which were negative anyway, and I demanded nothing but a clean break. It would have been easy to print them out, sign them, and leave them on the pillow, but that would be too kind. That would be a private end to a public humiliation. Preston and his family had spent a year trying to make me feel small. They had treated me like a prop, a servant, a mistake. They wanted to discard me in the dark so they could step into the light with Serafina. No. I closed the laptop. I would not give him the divorce tonight. There was a gala coming up, the launch of Zenith, my father's new mega project. The Blackwells were desperate to attend. They needed to be there to court investors. Preston would need a wife on his arm to keep up appearances one last time before he discarded me. I would give him his freedom, but I would choose the time, and I would choose the audience. I would wait until the lights were brightest, until the stakes were highest. I would let him think he was winning, right up until the moment the floor opened up. Just a temporary stop. I whispered to the empty room, repeating his words. I smiled. The train was about to derail, and he had no idea he was tied to the tracks. The lifeline the Blackwell family had been praying for arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in the form of a press release that shook the financial foundations of San Francisco. The Ashford Corporation, my father's conglomerate, officially announced Zenith, a mixed-use development project valued at over $4 billion. It was ambitious, futuristic, and exactly the kind of monumental undertaking that could salvage a sinking ship like Blackwell Holdings. If Montgomery Blackwell could secure even a fraction of the subcontracts for the electrical grid or the foundation work, his family's debts would be wiped clean and their reputation restored. The air in the Blackwell household shifted from feral dread to manic energy. Phones rang incessantly. Montgomery shouted orders at his secretaries. Cordelia paced the living room, calculating potential profits. But the most important object in the house was the invitation that had been hand-delivered by a courier. It was a thick cream-colored envelope with gold leaf lettering, inviting Mr. and Mrs. Preston Blackwell to the exclusive gala launch of Zenith. That small conjunction, and Mrs., was the only reason I was currently standing in Cordelia's dressing room being inspected like a piece of livestock. "You cannot wear your own clothes," Cordelia declared, wrinkling her nose as she gestured to a pile of fabric on the chaise lounge. "We are trying to impress the global elite, Thalia. We cannot have you looking like you just crawled out of a public library." She picked up a dress and threw it at me. It landed with a heavy thud against my chest. It was a garment that had clearly belonged to Vivian a decade ago, or perhaps Cordelia herself in a moment of terrible judgment. It was a taffeta nightmare in a muddy shade of olive green, with puffed sleeves that had gone out of style before I was born, and a neckline that was both too high and strangely suffocating. "Wear this," Cordelia commanded. "It is vintage, it is elegant. And listen to me very closely." She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Tonight is about business. It is about the survival of this family. You are there for one reason only, to fulfill the protocol of the invitation. You are not to speak to anyone unless spoken to. You are not to eat. You are not to express opinions. You are to stand in the corner like a decorative pillar and blend into the wallpaper. Do not let anyone know you are my daughter-in-law. If anyone asks, just smile and nod. Do you understand?" I held the hideous dress in my hands. The fabric felt scratchy and cheap despite its likely exorbitant original price tag. A year ago, this would have crushed me. I would have felt the sting of her shame. Now I only felt a cold, calculating amusement. This dress was not a humiliation. It was a costume. It was the perfect camouflage for a spy. "I understand, Cordelia," I said calmly. "I will be invisible." "Good," she snapped. "Now go get changed. The car leaves in 20 minutes. Do not make us wait." The venue for the gala was the grand hall of the new Ashford Tower, a skyscraper my father had built to dominate the skyline. As we entered the lobby, the sheer scale of the wealth on display was suffocating. The air smelled of expensive champagne and ambition. Men in tuxedos that cost more than a car stood in clusters, eyeing each other warily, while women in haute couture glided across the marble floors like swans. Preston was a bundle of nerves. He kept adjusting his cufflinks and checking his phone. He walked half a step ahead of me, as if trying to physically distance himself from the woman in the olive green taffeta. "Remember what my mother said?" he hissed over his shoulder as we approached the main ballroom. "Keep your mouth shut. I have to find the investors. I have to find Serafina." As soon as we passed the security checkpoint where the guards scanned our invites with solemn efficiency, Preston dropped the facade of being a husband entirely. He grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, shoved it into my hand, and scanned the room. "Stay here," he ordered, parking me near the entrance to the kitchen, next to a large potted palm. "I see Serafina over by the terrace. I need to go say hello. Do not move." He did not wait for a response. He smoothed his jacket and strode away, a smile instantly plastering itself onto his face as he approached a tall blonde woman in a shimmering red gown. Serafina Montgomery looked every bit the billionaire's daughter. She was radiant, confident, and when Preston reached her, she placed a proprietary hand on his arm. They looked like a power couple. They looked like they belonged on the cover of a magazine. I stood alone by the palm tree, sipping the champagne. It was a vintage. I recognized my father's favorite. I took a slow breath and let my eyes adjust to the room. From my vantage point in the shadows, I could see everything. I saw the desperation in Montgomery Blackwell's eyes as he tried to corner a senator near the bar. I saw Vivian laughing too loudly at a joke made by a banking executive she was trying to seduce. And then the room shifted. The lights dimmed slightly, and a hush fell over the crowd. A spotlight hit the main stage at the far end of the ballroom. A man walked out. Dominic Ashford. My father looked exactly as I remembered him from our last secret meeting, perhaps a little grayer at the temples, but his posture was as rigid as a steel beam. He wore a black tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He did not wave. He did not smile. He simply walked to the podium and placed his hands on the polished wood. The silence in the room was absolute. This was the man who held the fate of everyone in this room in his palm. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and resonant, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. "Tonight we look at the zenith, not as a limit, but as a challenge." I watched him with a swelling sense of pride. This was the man who had taught me that crying fixes nothing. This was the man who had pulled me out of the ashes. He scanned the crowd as he spoke, his gaze sweeping over the hundreds of faces looking up at him with adoration and greed. He did not see me yet. I was too far back, hidden in the gloom and the ugly green dress. The Blackwell family was practically vibrating. I saw Montgomery and Cordelia pushing their way toward the front, ignoring polite etiquette. They were trying to get close to the stage, trying to position themselves so that when Dominic stepped down, they would be the first hands he shook. They were stopped by a wall of broad-shouldered security guards. I watched Montgomery argue with the head of security. I could read his lips from across the room. "Do you know who I am? We are partners on this project." The guard did not budge. He simply shook his head. I watched Preston and Serafina join his parents. Preston was pointing at the stage, whispering something into Serafina's ear, looking important. He was selling the fantasy. He was probably telling her that the deal was already done, that he and Dominic Ashford were on a first-name basis. I took another sip of champagne. The irony was delicious. They were fighting to get close to the king, desperate for a crumb of his favor, completely unaware that the king's daughter was standing 30 feet away from them, wearing a dress they had pulled from a reject pile. They were bragging to anyone who would listen. I heard Cordelia's shrill voice carry over the low hum of the crowd as the speech ended and the applause thundered. "Oh yes," Cordelia was saying to a rival socialite. "We are very close to signing. Dominic and Montgomery have been in talks for months. Zenith is practically a joint venture. That is why we are here, of course. VIP guests." "Is that so?" the socialite asked, looking skeptical. "Absolutely," Vivian chimed in, tossing her hair. "We are expecting the formal announcement any day now. Preston is going to be heading up the residential division." I set my empty glass on a passing tray. The trap was set. They had walked right into the center of the cage, and they were locking the door themselves with every lie they told. The room was hot, filled with the body heat of 1,000 ambitious climbers. But I felt cool. I felt ready. I smoothed the skirts of the olive green taffeta. It was time to stop being a decorative pillar. It was time to step out of the corner. The atmosphere in the grand hall was thick enough to choke on. It was a cocktail of expensive perfume, stale ambition, and the nervous energy of 1,000 people pretending they were having the time of their lives. I had moved away from the potted palm, just a few feet, enough to be part of the circulation but still on the periphery. I held a fresh glass of red wine in my hand, not to drink, but to have something to do with my fingers. It was a shield, or so I thought. Vivienne Blackwell was circling the room like a shark in a chiffon dress. I had been watching her out of the corner of my eye for the last 20 minutes. She was bored. The investors were not paying enough attention to her, and the champagne was not strong enough to dull her inherent need for drama. Her eyes landed on me. I saw the spark of malice ignite instantly. To her, I was an easy target, a stain in an olive green dress that needed to be scrubbed out. She began to move toward me. She did not walk in a straight line. She wove through the crowd, laughing with a group of bankers here, nodding to a socialite there, but her trajectory was calculated. She waited until Serafina Montgomery was standing directly in front of me, her back turned to me, laughing at something Preston was saying. Serafina was radiant in her red gown, a beacon of wealth and success, the perfect foil to my drab existence. Vivienne accelerated as she passed behind me. She did not just bump me. She checked me with her shoulder, a sharp, violent shove disguised as a stumble. "Oops!" she squealed, her voice high and fake. The force of the impact sent me stumbling forward. I tried to correct my balance, but the heels of my shoes caught on the thick carpet. My hand jerked reflexively. The glass of Cabernet Sauvignon launched from my grip. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the dark red liquid arc through the air, a suspended wave of disaster, before it crashed against the back of Serafina's expensive gown. The glass shattered on the marble floor with a sound that cut through the ambient chatter like a gunshot. The splash was catastrophic. The wine soaked instantly into the silk, turning the shimmering red fabric into a dark, bloody mess. Serafina gasped, a sound of pure shock, and spun around, the cold liquid dripping down her back. The music did not stop, but the conversation in our immediate vicinity died instantly. A circle of silence expanded outward from us, drawing every eye in the room. "Oh my God," Vivienne shouted, far louder than necessary, bringing her hands to her face in a performance worthy of Broadway. "Thalia, what have you done?" I stood frozen, my hands still outstretched, the empty air where the glass had been now mocking me. Before I could utter a single word of explanation, before I could say that I was pushed, Cordelia Blackwell was upon me. She moved with the speed of a viper striking its prey. She did not look at the stain. She did not ask what happened. She saw an opportunity. She saw a stage. Cordelia stepped into the center of the circle and slapped me. It was not a heavy blow. It was a sharp, stinging slap across my left cheek, delivered with just enough force to make a sound that echoed in the quiet space. The physical pain was negligible, but the social violence was absolute. It was a mark of ownership, a public declaration that I was something to be disciplined, not someone to be respected. "You clumsy, low-class fool," Cordelia shrieked, her voice trembling with manufactured rage. "I told you that you did not belong here. Look at what you have done to poor Serafina. Look at this mess." My cheek stung, heat rising to the surface of my skin. I looked around. Hundreds of faces were staring at me. Some were amused, some were horrified, but most looked at me with the detached curiosity of people watching a car crash. I was the entertainment. "I was pushed," I said, my voice steady but quiet. "Do not you dare lie to me," Cordelia cut me off, stepping closer, her finger jabbing the air inches from my face. "I saw you. You were stumbling around like a drunkard. This is what happens when you drag someone from the gutter and try to put them in a palace. They just dirty the floors." The crowd murmured. I heard the words gutter and drunk ripple through the onlookers. Then Preston pushed through the crowd. He looked frantic. He looked at Serafina, who was now dabbing at her dress with a napkin, looking on the verge of tears. He looked at his mother, breathless with indignation. And then he looked at me. This was the moment. The final test. A husband would ask his wife if she was hurt. A partner would stand between her and the mob. Preston rushed past me as if I were invisible. He went straight to Serafina. "Serafina, I am so sorry," he pleaded, his hands hovering over her ruined dress, desperate to fix the unfixable. "Are you all right? We will pay for the dress. We will get you a new one immediately. Please forgive us." "It is ruined, Preston," Serafina whimpered, casting a look of pure disgust in my direction. "It is sticky." Preston spun around to face me. His face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. The vein in his forehead was bulging. "What is wrong with you?" he screamed. He did not care that we were in public. He did not care that the most powerful people in San Francisco were watching. He only cared that his ticket to the bank was stained with wine. "Can you not do one simple thing? Can you not just stand there without destroying everything I work for? Why do you always have to embarrass me?" "Preston, your sister pushed me," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Stop blaming everyone else for your incompetence," he roared. "You are a liability, Thalia. You have been a stone around my neck since the day I met you." Cordelia stepped up beside him, presenting a united front of Blackwell indignation. She smoothed her dress and looked down her nose at me, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She finally had the excuse she needed. "You are a disgrace," Cordelia hissed, loud enough for the back row to hear. "You are just a parasitic orphan who clawed her way into a family that is leagues above her station. You think you can stand next to us? You think you are one of us? You are nothing. You are a laborer playing dress-up." She pointed a manicured finger toward the exit. "Get out. Get out of my sight before I have security drag you out like the trash you are." I stood there, the wine from the splash spotting the hem of my ugly green dress. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was not shame. It was not fear. It was the feeling of a heavy weight finally snapping off a chain. The last thread of obligation I felt toward this man and his family dissolved. Preston looked at me, his chest heaving. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to distance himself so completely that Serafina would see him as a victim of a bad marriage, not a partner in it. "You heard my mother," Preston said, his voice dropping to a cold, venomous tone. "Go home, Thalia. Pack your things. We will speak tomorrow, but do not expect to stay in my apartment. I am filing for divorce in the morning. I am done. I have tolerated your inadequacy long enough." The word divorce hung in the air. The crowd seemed to lean in. This was better than the speeches. This was a live destruction of a marriage. I looked at Preston. I looked at the sweat on his upper lip. I looked at the fear in his eyes, the fear of poverty, the fear of irrelevance. Then I looked at Cordelia, who was smirking, and Vivian, who was hiding a laugh behind her champagne flute. I did not cry. I did not beg. I reached into my purse and pulled out a handkerchief. Slowly, methodically, I wiped a spot of wine from my hand. I folded the handkerchief and put it back. I straightened my spine. I lifted my chin. The girl from the orphanage was gone. The architect who scraped paint was gone. Standing in her place was the daughter of Dominic Ashford, and she was done playing games. I looked at Preston, and for the first time I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of a judge delivering a verdict. "Fine," I said. My voice was not loud, but in the silence of the room, it carried like a bell. "I will go. I will give you exactly what you want, Preston. But I want you to remember this moment. I want you to freeze this image in your mind." I swept my gaze over Cordelia and Vivian. "Remember the sound of your voices right now," I continued. "Remember how powerful you felt, because from this second forward, this is the highest you will ever be. Enjoy the view from the peak, Blackwells. It is a long way down." I turned my back on them. I did not run. I did not rush. I began to walk toward the exit with a slow, deliberate cadence. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, dismissing me, thinking I was walking out into the cold night of defeat. They had no idea I was just clearing the blast zone. I turned my back on the Blackwell family, intending to walk the 100 or so feet to the heavy double doors that led to the exit. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that defied the calm mask I had plastered onto my face. I had taken 3 steps, just 3, when a sound cut through the murmuring crowd like a whip crack. It was not a shout. It was not a scream. It was a sharp, rhythmic tapping. Thump, thump. It came from the main stage. Someone had tapped a finger against the live microphone. The sound system, tuned to perfection by the best audio engineers in the city, amplified that small noise until it sounded like the heartbeat of a giant. Instantly, the room fell silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. The ambient chatter, the clinking of silverware, the polite laughter, it all evaporated. I stopped. I did not turn around immediately. I felt a change in the air pressure of the room, a shift in the gravity. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. They were not the hurried steps of a stage manager coming to fix a technical issue. They were the steps of a man who owned the ground he walked on. I turned my head slowly. Dominic Ashford was descending from the high podium. He did not use the side stairs. He stepped down the front, bypassing the VIP investors who were waiting with bated breath to shake his hand. He did not look at the board of directors. He did not look at the press pit where cameras were flashing blindly. He was looking straight ahead. He was looking at the chaos near the kitchen entrance. He was looking at me. The crowd, a sea of San Francisco's most powerful and arrogant figures, parted. It was an instinctual reaction, like animals sensing a predator. A wide aisle formed spontaneously, clearing a direct path from the stage to where I stood next to the spilled wine and the preening Blackwells. My father walked with a terrifying calmness. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone that had terrified financial districts for 40 years. He moved through the ballroom, and the silence stretched tight, threatening to snap. As he approached our circle, the Blackwells visibly brightened. I could see the gears turning in Cordelia's mind. She thought he was coming to address the disturbance. She thought he was coming to apologize to Serafina Montgomery, the billionaire heiress whose dress was ruined. She thought, in her infinite delusion, that Dominic Ashford was coming to validate her authority. Cordelia stepped forward, smoothing her dress. A sycophantic smile plastered across her face. She practically curtsied. "Mr. Ashford," she gushed, her voice pitching high with nerves and excitement. "I am so terribly sorry you had to witness this. It is just a minor domestic incident. This clumsy girl is just a mistake my son made, a brief, unfortunate lapse in judgment that is being corrected immediately. We were just escorting her out so she does not bother your guests anymore." Preston straightened his tie, puffing out his chest, ready to play the role of the responsible man handling a crisis. He stepped up beside his mother, nodding solemnly. "We handled it, sir," Preston said, projecting his voice to sound authoritative. "We are protecting the integrity of your event. She is leaving now." Dominic Ashford did not break stride. He did not look at Cordelia. He did not look at Preston. He did not even glance at Serafina, who was standing there shivering in her wine-soaked dress, waiting for the great man to acknowledge her existence. It was as if they were ghosts. It was as if they were made of glass. Dominic walked right past Preston, so close that the wind from his movement ruffled Preston's perfectly styled hair. He walked past Cordelia, leaving her with her mouth open mid-sentence, her hand extended for a handshake that would never come. He stopped 2 feet in front of me. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents in the ceiling. I could hear the shallow, terrified breathing of Vivienne standing behind me. I looked up at him. My father, the man who had found me playing with glue and sticks in an orphanage, who told me I could build the world. He looked at the olive green taffeta dress, the cheap fabric that Cordelia had forced me to wear. He looked at the spot of red wine on the hem. He looked at my face, which I was fighting to keep composed. I was shivering. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me cold, and the air in the hall was frigid. Without saying a word, Dominic reached up and unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket. It was a garment of midnight blue wool, tailored in Milan, worth more than the car Preston drove. He shrugged it off his shoulders with an elegant, fluid motion. He stepped forward and draped the heavy, warm coat over my shoulders. The smell of him, cedarwood, old paper, and expensive tobacco enveloped me instantly. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of the Ashford estate. The warmth seeped into my bones, stopping the tremors in my arms. He adjusted the lapels, his hands gentle, tucking the coat around me as if I were still 10 years old, and we were standing in the snow. He looked into my eyes, and for the first time that night, the stone mask cracked. His eyes were soft. They held a profound, infinite sadness for what I had endured, and a burning, cold rage for those who had caused it. He did not turn to face the room. He spoke to me, but he pitched his voice so that the deep baritone rolled through the silent ballroom, reaching every corner, every ear, every stunned witness. "Thalia, daughter," he said. The word hit the room like a physical blow. Daughter. I heard a gasp ripple through the crowd, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the space. Dominic continued, his hands still resting on my shoulders, weighing me down, grounding me. "I told you a long time ago, you should never lower yourself to fit into a world that is too small for you. You do not shrink to accommodate people who have no spine." He paused, and then he slowly turned his head. He did not turn his body, just his head, looking over his shoulder at the frozen tableau of the Blackwell family. His eyes were no longer soft. They were dead. They were the eyes of a shark smelling blood in the water. "And you certainly do not apologize to people who are not qualified to polish your shoes," he added. He turned back to me, offering me his arm. "It is time to go home, Thalia." Behind me, the silence was shattered by a single sharp sound. Crash. Preston's hand had gone numb. The crystal glass of champagne he had been holding slipped from his fingers and smashed against the marble floor. The sound echoed the earlier accident, but this time, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I looked over my father's shoulder. Cordelia Blackwell looked as though she had been drained of blood. Her face was a mask of gray ash. Her eyes were wide, bulging, staring at the man she had just insulted. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock, but no sound came out. The realization was crashing down on her, a tsunami of horror. She had slapped the sole heir of the Ashford Empire. She had called the daughter of the most powerful man in San Francisco a parasite. Preston stood amidst the shards of his glass, his hands trembling violently. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the moment his soul broke. He saw the resemblance now. He saw the posture. He saw the connection he had been too blind, too selfish to see for a year. He realized that the orphan he was about to divorce was the princess of the kingdom he had been trying to enter. Serafina Montgomery had taken a step back, distancing herself from Preston as if he were radioactive. I looked at Preston one last time. I saw the ruin in his eyes. I saw the calculation of his losses, the money, the reputation, the future. I took my father's arm. The wool of his coat was heavy on my shoulders, a shield against the world. "Yes, Father," I said softly. "Let us go home." The silence in the grand hall was no longer a void. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the lungs of every person in the room. My father, Dominic Ashford, did not look at the crowd. He slowly pivoted on his heel, his movement precise and predatory, until his gaze landed squarely on the huddle of the Blackwell family. He did not look at them with anger. Anger implies that the object of your emotion has value, that they have the power to affect you. Dominic looked at them with the dispassionate clinical interest of an exterminator, identifying a termite infestation in the basement of a property he intended to renovate. He raised a single finger, beckoning to a figure standing in the shadows of the stage. Marcus, his chief of staff and personal executioner in all matters financial, stepped forward instantly. He held a tablet in his hand, his face a mask of professional indifference. "Marcus," Dominic said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the acoustic authority of a gavel striking a sounding block. "Clarify something for me. Is this the Blackwell entity, the family currently petitioning for the electrical subcontract on the Zenith project?" Marcus tapped the screen of his tablet once. "Yes, sir. Montgomery and Preston Blackwell. The contract is currently on your desk, awaiting your signature at 9 tomorrow morning. It represents 80% of their projected revenue for the next fiscal year." The crowd gasped. It was a crude display of financial voyeurism. Everyone in that room knew what those numbers meant. They knew the Blackwells were leveraged to the hilt. Dominic nodded as if confirming a lunch order. "Shred it." "Sir?" Marcus asked, though he knew the answer. He was playing his part in the theater of destruction. "Cancel the contract," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. "And issue a memo to our banking partners, Chase, Goldman, the private equity firms in Zurich. Inform them that Ashford Corporation is initiating a full divestment from any project, asset, or portfolio that carries the name Blackwell. If they hold Blackwell debt, we will not hold theirs. Make it clear that they are radioactive." "Understood, sir," Marcus replied. "I will initiate the calls within the hour." It was a death sentence. It was not just a rejection. It was a blockade. In less than 30 seconds, my father had not only stripped them of their future income, but had also ensured that no reputable financial institution on the planet would touch them. He had turned their name into a contagion. I looked at Montgomery Blackwell. The man was clutching his chest, his face the color of wet putty. He was doing the mental math, realizing that the loans he had taken out against the expectation of this contract were now immediate liabilities. He was bankrupt. He just did not have the paperwork yet. I felt a strange sense of lightness. The heavy wool of my father's coat felt like armor, but the weight on my left hand felt unbearable. It was the only thing left that tied me to the man standing amidst the shattered glass. I stepped away from my father for a brief moment and approached Preston. He was standing like a statue, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the space where his future used to be. I reached for my left hand. I twisted the modest gold band with the small cloudy diamond, the ring he had bought because it was all he could afford after his parents cut him off. The ring I had cherished because I thought it represented sacrifice. Now I saw it for what it was, a shackle made of cheap metal. I pulled it off. My finger felt naked, but free. I took Preston's hand. It was cold and clammy. I pressed the ring into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "You were right, Preston," I said. My voice was steady, cutting through the whimpering sounds coming from his mother. "You told me I did not fit the standards of your family. You were absolutely correct." I leaned in closer, so only he could hear the final nail being driven into the coffin of our marriage. "My standards are higher than you could ever hope to reach," I whispered. "You wanted a princess to save you. You got a queen who could have built you a kingdom, but you were too busy looking at the floor to notice." I turned back to Dominic. He offered me his arm again, a small, proud smile touching his lips. We walked toward the exit. The sea of tuxedos and gowns parted instantly. People bowed their heads, not out of politeness, but out of fear. They were witnessing the wrath of a god, and they were terrified of being caught in the aftershocks. We did not look back, but as we stepped out into the cool night air of San Francisco, where the Ashford limousine was waiting with its engine purring, the sounds of the collapse drifted out behind us. It started with a scream from Cordelia. "You idiot. You useless, spineless idiot. You let her go. You let billions walk out the door." Then came the voice of Montgomery, roaring in panic. "Call the bank, Cordelia. Shut up and call the bank before the market opens." And then the sound of heels clicking rapidly on marble, moving away from the Blackwells. I knew without looking that it was Serafina Montgomery. She was a survivor of the social jungle. She knew a carcass when she saw one. She would be in her car before Preston could even unlock his phone, and by the time he tried to call her, his number would be blocked. She would erase him from her digital life before he even left the building. The drive to the Ashford estate was silent, but it was a peaceful silence. I watched the city lights blur past the window, realizing that for the first time in a year, I was not holding my breath. The fallout the next morning was mathematical in its cruelty. I sat in the sunroom of my father's estate, drinking coffee that cost more per pound than my entire weekly budget as Mrs. Blackwell had been, on the tablet in front of me. The financial news was streaming in real time. At 9:30 in the morning, when the opening bell rang on Wall Street, Blackwell Holdings opened down 40%. By 10:15, after the internal memo from Ashford Corporation leaked to the financial blogs, the stock plummeted another 20%. It was a freefall. The headlines were brutal. Blackwell Empire crumbles under Ashford sanctions. The $4 billion mistake. My phone, which I had reactivated with a new number, remained silent, but I had kept my old phone active for one reason: to watch the desperation. It sat on the table, vibrating incessantly. Preston, 12 missed calls. Preston, voicemail. Thalia, please, we need to talk. My mother is hysterical. The bank is seizing the accounts. You cannot do this. We are married. Please pick up. Preston, voicemail. I am sorry. I did not mean what I said. I love you. It was the pressure. Please, Thalia. Cordelia is talking about selling the house. I watched the screen light up again. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold logic of a structural engineer watching a building collapse because the foundation was made of sand. I pressed the button to permanently disconnect the line. According to the report from my father's security team, Preston went to our apartment in Oakland at noon. He was likely looking for me, or perhaps looking for a place to hide from the creditors who were already banging on the doors of his family's estate. He would have arrived to find the locks changed. A bright orange notice was pasted to the door. Property seized by Ashford Real Estate Trust. Access prohibited. In the hallway, sitting lonely and pathetic under the flickering fluorescent light, was a single cardboard box. It contained his cheap suits, his cologne, and the few personal items he had brought into my life. He had told me once that he wanted to build everything with me. Now he had exactly what he had built: a box of used clothes and a closed door. The silence he encountered in that hallway was the answer to every insult he had ever thrown at me. It was the end of the noise. It was the beginning of his nothingness. 6 months is not a long time in the grand scheme of the universe, but in the life of a woman who has decided to reclaim her name, it is an eternity. It is enough time for seasons to change, for concrete to cure, and for the ink on a divorce settlement to dry completely. I stood in the center of my new office, a glass-walled sanctuary on the 85th floor of Zenith. This was the building that had started it all, the steel and glass titan that my father and I had unveiled to the world. It was finished now, dominating the San Francisco skyline, a testament to what happens when you build with integrity rather than deceit. On the mahogany desk in front of me lay a copy of Architectural Digest. The cover did not feature a house or landscape. It featured a portrait. It was me. I was wearing a white suit, sharp and tailored, my arms crossed, staring into the camera with a gaze that held no apology. The headline read, "The Iron Heiress, Thalia Ashford, on the Architecture of Power." I ran my fingers over the glossy paper. I was no longer Thalia the orphan, or Thalia the struggling site manager, or Thalia the embarrassing wife of a wannabe politician. I was the creative director of the Ashford Corporation. I was also the founder of the Hawthorne Foundation, a $250 million initiative dedicated to rebuilding the state care system that had raised me. We were not just painting walls. We were redesigning the way forgotten children experience the world, ensuring that no 6-year-old would ever have to glue broken sticks together to feel a sense of control again. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down. The city looked like a circuit board from up here, a grid of electricity and movement. The cars were just specks of light. The people, invisible dots. It gave me a perspective I had desperately needed. From this height, the monsters of my past looked very small indeed. My eyes drifted across the skyline to the giant LED billboard on the adjacent tower, the one that scrolled the daily financial news and market updates. It was usually a blur of numbers and stock tickers, but occasionally a headline would catch the rhythm of the cycle. And there it was. Blackwell Estate sold at auction for fraction of value. The text scrolled by, dispassionate and cold. It was followed by a smaller subheadline: Family assets liquidated to satisfy creditors. I watched the words disappear off the screen, replaced by an advertisement for a luxury watch. The Blackwell name, which Cordelia had guarded like a crown jewel, was now just a footnote in a cautionary tale about bad debt. I knew the details, of course. My father's legal team kept tabs on them, not out of malice, but out of due diligence. Cordelia and Montgomery had lost the mansion in Marin County. They were currently living in a 2-bedroom rental in Vallejo, far away from the social circles they used to terrorize. The friends they had tried to impress at the gala had vanished the moment the credit cards stopped working. Vivienne had married a man twice her age who owned a chain of car washes, desperate for security. And Preston. I had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Preston was working in the city. He was not in a corner office. He was not running for city council. He was working the evening shift at a mid-range bar in the financial district. He was pouring drinks for the very men he used to try to impress. I imagined him standing behind that bar, wiping down the counter, forced to smile at customers who snapped their fingers at him, forced to serve people who treated him like furniture. It was poetic justice that no writer could have scripted better. He had treated his wife like a servant, and now life had handed him an apron. I waited for the surge of satisfaction. I waited for the dark, gloating joy that comes from seeing an enemy fall. But as I watched the traffic crawl along Market Street, I realized I felt nothing. I did not feel happy about their ruin. I did not feel sad. I felt a profound, peaceful indifference. It was the feeling of walking past a house you used to live in and realizing you no longer have the key, and you do not want it. Their suffering did not add to my wealth. Their poverty did not make me richer. The only thing that mattered was that they were no longer in my orbit. I had realized that the greatest revenge was not burning their world down, though we had certainly done that. The greatest revenge was building my own world so high, so bright, and so magnificent that they would have to crane their necks just to see the shadow of it. I was living a life of purpose and power, and they were merely spectators watching the show from the cheap seats. The intercom on my desk buzzed, breaking the silence. "Miss Ashford, it was my assistant. The board is ready for you in the conference room. They want to discuss the expansion plans for the Detroit project, and your father is on line 1. I pressed the button. "Tell the board I will be there in 5 minutes. Put my father through." I picked up the phone. "Hello, Father." "Thalia?" Dominic's voice was warm, the voice of a man who was finally looking at his equal. "I just saw the magazine." "You look formidable." "I learned from the best," I replied, a genuine smile touching my lips. "Are you ready for the meeting? The Detroit proposal is aggressive." "I am ready," I said, turning away from the window. I turned my back on the view of the city. I turned my back on the LED screen and the name Blackwell. I turned my back on the ghost of the girl who had let a man make her feel small. In fact, I have a few changes I want to make to the blueprints. We need to think bigger. I hung up the phone and grabbed my portfolio. I caught my reflection in the glass wall one last time. The woman staring back was not a survivor. She was a conqueror. The olive green dress was a distant memory, replaced by the armor of success. I walked out of the office, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor, a sound not of regret, but of momentum. They say you can never go home again, but they are wrong. You can go home. You just have to build it yourself, brick by brick, using the stones that others threw at you. They said I did not fit their standard. They were right, because my world, they were never qualified to enter. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment below telling me your location and what you thought of Thalia's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and redemption, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that like button to help us share this story with even more listeners around the world.